Right, hello and welcome on the today's task. This screencast is dedicated to fragments and tabs, and also restoring fragment state. So we're gonna use fragments and typical navigation elements like tab layout or ViewPager. Okay, so we start with an empty activity, and in this empty activity we're gonna have a linear layout, simple one, vertical, several vertical elements. We won't have a text view here, we don't need it. We will have an Android orientation though, a vertical one, as I said. Now we want to add some fragments here, two fragments, one on the top and the bottom. We're gonna have a frame layout, but to do that we need to first have a fragment in our application. So let's do that. Let's create three fragments, three blank fragments. We're gonna call it a static fragment. This one will be the one that we'll add statically to the page here, and then we're gonna have two other fragments, one dynamic fragment 1 and the other one which we're gonna call a dynamic fragment 2. Yeah, blank activity. No, I want to take a blank fragment blank, and this one we're gonna call a dynamic fragment 2. All right. So in our main activity we're gonna put a static fragment here, and then we're gonna take a frame layout here. Yeah, and it seems that I forgot to put the orientation here. It's vertical. Now I want this one to be 40% of the screen and this one to be 60% of the screen, which means 01, 04, 06. And then we can put these to 0 dp and this one to 0 dp, because it will be automatically adjusted based on the weight. Right, and this frame layout also needs an ID, and this ID will be maybe fragment container. Let's call it like that. Okay, so now we have a fragment, oh yeah, this should be a match parent, just so that it's wide enough. All right, so we have our dynamic frame for our dynamic fragment and our fragment on top. Okay, now let's do something to make these. So the application will work like that. There will be a static fragment on top, and it will have two radio buttons. And depending on the chosen one, the chosen button, the fragment in the bottom layout will be changed. Okay, so we'll start with having these two items here. So we'll start with putting a linear layout here in this static fragment, and we're gonna put a few buttons here. We're gonna put radio group here and radio buttons, and we're gonna call those radio buttons say show F1, and here we're gonna have show F2, and this one is gonna be a show F2 item, and this one will be a show F1 item, and the group will be ID show group. Yeah, let's make it like that. Yeah, and these two should be fine. Now the dynamic fragment 1, we're just gonna change the text here, So we're gonna make it bigger and more colorful. So let's say it will be purple, and it will be size of say 60 sp. So which will look something like that. And then we also have our fragment dynamic 2, and this one will be slightly different. So we're gonna leave a text view here with a counter. So we're gonna put the initial text empty, and then we're gonna put a button here. And this button will be, well, maybe, oh, okay, that would be fine too. And wrap content here, and then it will have an Android ID of ID counter. So this one will be this will be a counter, and we'll increment the counter by using this button. So let's go. Right, and we'll implement that a little later. Okay, now what we want to do is we want to put these. So first of all, let's start the application. Maybe let's not get ahead ourselves. So this is my old application that does pretty much the same, and so we're just gonna implement that. It will look a bit different, of course. Okay, so we have our button, and we can click it. Now nothing happens because we have no listener for that. So if we want to put a listener, we should put it somewhere where we can. Basically, the first place we can do that. And the first place we can do that is the place where we create the view, which is this inflate call. So we can create a view v here, and then from this view we can find element by ID, and if we want to find a show group here, so this is a radio group, let's call it RG, and to this radio group we can set an on check change listener, and here we can do something. Now the problem is that well, this is a different fragment, and this fragment doesn't know that the other two fragments exist, and it shouldn't know about it. The only component that does know about it is the activity. So what we need to do is we need to propagate the information from our static fragment to our activity, and we do that by the most standard way that is done in object-oriented design, which is by implementing an interface on option checked. And here we have an option ID. Well, yeah, the actual interface looks like that. On option checked, and here's the ID. And now we need to have a listener of this type, of course. On options checked, listener, and now we need to acquire this listener somehow. Now there are a few ways of doing that. One of the ways would be, well, we cannot do that in constructor because the constructor must be empty, and that is required by Android. We could add a setter, but that might be troublesome as well. We can override on attach. Now you might see this funny thing here, this context. In our case, this is basically an activity. In older versions, this on attach was actually taking a parameter of type activity. Now it's context, but it's pretty much the same functionally, for us at least. Right, so on this attach, what we need to do is we need to try to cast our context into this on option listener. On options checked, context. Now it may happen that it doesn't that the context doesn't implement that interface, And in that case, we'll get a class cast exception. And we can just say, whoops, that's not very good. Oops. Okay, so now if we run that application, you'll see that we can click things, which means that it more or less works, but we have a whoops in the log. And that basically means that our context doesn't implement this on options checked. And that's true, because we didn't implement that. And so here we need to write implements on option checked, and then implement method on option checked. And here what we want to do is we want to say if id equals to our id show f1, then we want to show f1, and else we want to show f2. And by show I mean assign it to a fragment. So we're gonna do it like this: fragment f, and this fragment f is gonna be null for starters, and then we're gonna say it is a new dynamic fragment 1, and otherwise it is a new dynamic fragment 2. But that's not all. We need to place our fragment somewhere, and to do that we need a fragment manager and a fragment transaction. And we acquire it this way, so by setting fragment support manager, and then this fragment support manager can begin a transaction, and then in the transaction we want to replace the element in the fragment container with f, and we want to commit it. And this is the initial implementation of what is needed to handle this change, this check. There's one more thing: we need to propagate it. So we'll add this. We're gonna add this check to make sure that the listener exists, and if it does exist, then we forward the checked ID here. Let's see. Okay, so we have our hello blank fragment and this button with empty text. We're gonna fix that later. So it changes. Now you might want to support the back button, because we don't support it now. If you want to support back button, first of all you need to add to backstack. We don't want to name it this transaction, and this transaction by adding it to backstack, you'll get something. So well, the basic support for that button. So these fragments will be adjusted. Now these won't, so that's not a full solution, but that's a big part of that. Right. So let's add this name here, because it's kind of okay. Click to update counter. Yeah, so this works. I'm gonna remove that because it doesn't work into the fullest. You might want to leave that depending on your application. You might prefer to have that or to leave it out. It's up to you. All right. So that's the first part of the exercise related to handling of fragments and propagating of fragment information. Now, what we might want to do is we might want to implement this counter thing that we've already created. Now we want to create. We will implement it, the handler here, and in a second I'll tell you why. So here we're gonna have a private int count. Let's call it counter. That starts with 0. And here we're gonna find view by ID, and this view is gonna be our ID button. It's not called button. How is it called? Let's check again. How did I call the button? Counter. Oh, and the text view is not called anyway. So let's call this one counter button, and this thing let's call a counter. So our ID and this thing is counter button. I'll call it button B, and then we add yeah, we need to import that. Then we need to add an on-click listener, and this will be new on-click listener, and this listener will increment the counter, and then it will set text in the text view. So let's have a text view t equals v find view by ID, and the other ID will be a counter. And here we're gonna say t set text integer to string the counter. Right. Let's see if that works. This should work. Now you might wonder why we did it in onCreate view. That's because this is the first place where we actually have a view that we can attach to. So we can set S2, then click to update counter. I think we should show the counter somewhere, because otherwise it's not visible, right? Yeah. So let this be width of match parent, height of wrap content. And this layout is a frame layout, which means we won't see it. So let it be also a linear layout with or vertical orientation. Vertical. Yeah. So let's go. And we have this little counter over here. Let's make it slightly bigger. Text size, let it be 60 sp, and we don't need to change the color. I think it's visible enough when it's big. 1, 2, 3. As you can see, we have our counter, we have our fragment, and once we remove the fragment, we change the fragment. This one just disappears because we create a new fragment each time, and that's pretty reasonable. So we could reuse the old fragment if we wanted to keep them. So that would be something like that. A dynamic fragment 1 fragment f1 equals new dynamic fragment 1, and that dynamic fragment 2 f2 equals new dynamic fragment 2. And here we would remove this thing. Well, we wouldn't remove this thing. We would say f1, and here we have f2. And now the state is technically preserved, because you can see we have 8, 9, 10, but the view is not. And to restore that, we would need to set the text also here, because right now after we create the view, the text view contains the default value, and only after the click we update the value. So we need to set the initial one here. And here we have 0, we have 3, and we have 3 again. So this is the first part. Now what can happen is we can rotate the device like that, and then our counter will be reset. And that's usually not good, not something we want to do. So we need to do something to address that. And what we need to do is we need to save the bundle state. and that's the fragment state, and that's because our activity is removed each time the device rotates. So once the device is rotated, the whole activity is cleaned up and then created from the beginning. And that's because device orientation is one of the reasons one of the selectors for layout and for other resources. We're gonna use that in a second. But first we're gonna restore the state somehow, because we don't really like the idea that our counter is restarted on each rotation. So to do that, we need to override again something, and this time it's a public void on save instance state, and this takes bundle b as an argument. So first we need to call the same method. This is a regular pattern, so if you have a lifetime routine in Android, you will usually start with the function with calling the same function on the parent. Okay, so once we did that, we can save our own element. We can put an int. We need to have a unique name here, but I'm not gonna care about it for now. We only have one fragment, right? And I'm gonna put a counter here, and then we need to restore that. We could restore that in the onCreate, but only in the onCreate view we have the actual view, so I'm gonna restore it here, and I'm gonna do it somewhere here. So counter. Okay, so let's do it like that. If saved instance state is not null, because it might be null if that's the first start of the app. For example, if the fragment is created for the first time. If it's not null, then I'm gonna say that counter equals to b get saved instance state get int clicks, and then go as usual. Okay, so let's click sometime. Okay, our item is reset. Alright, so we know that this way of restoring state of fragments doesn't work as well as we would like it to work, and it has a reason, and the reason is that in our main activity we create those two fragments each time when the main activity is created. Now we could do a few workarounds, so we could implement onSave instance state here. In the other fragment, and then make sure that we only update it once the item is not visible. Well, once the item is recreated, and this would be slightly more tricky. So these fragments would need to be added to the would need to be supported by the support manager, by this thing, and then we would need to check if the fragment is visible or not. So as you can see, that's quite a bit of work, which we don't really want to do right now, and we're gonna use. I'm gonna get back to this part of the exercise later. Once we have the tabbed activity, as you'll see that it will be much easier there. Right, so let's go to the activity and to the tabbed activity. So let's call it a tabbed activity, and let it be a launcher activity. And this one is slightly more complex. As you can see that there are already 4 classes added and 3 new fragments. We have activity tabbed and two new layouts, and fragment tabbed. So the one that is interesting for us is mostly this section adapter. So what happens is that we get a ViewPager here in the tab. Maybe we can just run it and then you'll see. So let's use a specified activity, and it will be a tabbed activity. I've added it to the launch, by the way, so we can run it directly. Yeah, and this one is fragment tabbed. So it's just to make it simple. We're gonna remove that in a few seconds. So we have our tab. The tabs are not visible, so we're gonna change the color here, because I hate that. But as you can see, that's a ViewPager, so it just manages the pages. That's why it's a pager. So one interesting thing here is if you take a look at the manifest, this activity uses a theme that is no action bar, but in the app you saw that we do have an action bar. So that is because in the activity tab we use a custom bar that is taken from a Google Android material, and that's a special thing that is not the standard one, let's say. And here we want. I did remove this floating button on the bottom right, because we don't want not want to use it. And we're gonna change this tab selected color to red. And here we also need to remove this thing. So what we have now is we still have those two elements. Now what we want to do is we want to really keep these tabs to display our fragments. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna change this get item thing, and these two things. So these tab titles, I'm gonna remove this array. You could leave that in the array and just add things to the resources. That's also okay. I'm just going to add an if here. That's of course not the best way if you're gonna write a real world application, but for our purposes it's good enough. So we're gonna call it fragment1, and the other one will be of course fragment2. Right, and the items will also need to change. So if position is equals to 0 equals 0, and else, and we don't need this, I think, or maybe we do. Oh yeah, this was for items, so we don't care about it. So if the position is 0, then we return a new dynamic fragment1, and else we return a new dynamic fragment2. Let's see. So we have fragment1, we have fragment2, we can click to update, and once we rotate, the thing remains. And that's because we did implement the two methods on the instance. The first one in save on instance state, and the second one this restoration. So this thing is called because we use the ViewPager. And as you saw when we were using our manual thingies, our manual fragment management, it wasn't that easy to do that. And we would need to really do some tricks to manage it. I mean, obviously that's possible because the ViewPager does exactly that. So it manages the fragments internally and saves the state in memory. So we can dig a little deeper and see where it is done. But that's slightly more complex than we would like it to be. And really that's not done by the adapter, but by the pager itself. So it's in the activity, this ViewPager. I'm not sure if I have sources for that, so it might happen that this will be obfuscated. Restore. Yeah, it's a pretty powerful class, and it has quite a few. Yeah, I guess I don't have everything downloaded. So those annotations, they are quite. Yeah, well, if you would like to see where does this restoration happen and what we would need to do to implement it ourselves, we can use quite a simple thing. So we can take this on create view and we can print a stack trace here. So we can create a new exception and print a stack trace of it. So then once we run it, and go to this one. Okay, and rotate because it's on saved instance state. I'm doing it here because the other location, so the other constructor would be in the pager adapter because, well, that's the default place where things happen. But here is the restoration. So that's why I didn't do it in the constructor. And by the way, the ViewPager ViewPager adapter, if it overrides this pager adapter, it manages the state internally. So this thing is only called once, and then this fragment is reused for future. You can use ones that if you have fragments that are really heavy, then you can use versions of this adapter that drop the ones that are not used currently, but usually you'll want to use that. Okay, anyway, let's go back here. So if we want to see what is called to manage this state, so we can go slightly deeper here. So we have our fragment controller and fragment activity. So in our fragment activity, our fragments are dispatched, and our fragment manager manages it internally. So what needs to happen is that those fragments need to be attached to the manager, and that's not always that simple. So in our case, only one was attached, the one that was in the active transaction. So where is it? This one, the current F, and that one could be restored, but the other one not. So let's see if it's the same case in the ViewPager. So let's see the other fragment and rotate, and then go back. No, ViewPager manages that correctly. All right. So we managed to create two fragments, dynamic ones. Use a ViewPager to rotate between them, and restore state on rotation. Now, one more thing I would like to do is add a new layout for fragment 2. So it's not that bad here. You know what? I'm gonna make it slightly better. I'm gonna center this thing. Gravity center. So I'm gonna move the text to the center so that it looks slightly better. And it's not this one, it's text alignment center. It should be this one. Yeah, so it's not that bad here. I mean, the button is big and the counter is small, but it's not that bad. But once we rotate it, the counter is much bigger. So let's say that in this case, in the landscape mode, we would like to have them one by one and not both together. So to do that, we need to add a new layout mode, a new layout directory, and this is, you can do that by adding where is that? That's a directory, but it's not this one. Yeah, well, anyway, let's just add it. Okay, we go to app. So there's no magic here, we're just adding a new directory in resources, and this is Android resource directory, and this is directory for layout. And our qualifier will be orientation. And we wanna create directory for landscape. So the name that will be created will be layout land. And in our layout land, we're gonna have something for our fragment dynamic. And it will be pretty much the same as previous. Oh, yeah, and you can, as you can see, we already have a special view for that. If you take the other fragment, the other layout, you get a port. This is called a port view, and this one is the land view. So it's already displayed in the landscape mode. So what we're gonna do here is we're gonna make it horizontal. And because of that, we cannot make this thing match parent, but we'll make them both wrap content. So it will be something like that. It's horizontal, so it should work more or less. Why they're next to each other? Aren't they next to each other? Not sure. Maybe we can make this a bit smaller. And then make this one. No, that would be okay, I guess. Let's see. So once we run it in this mode, they go one next to the other. If we use this mode, port mode, they go one below. And the data is preserved between each run, and it works exactly as expected. And that's basically everything I wanted to show you in this exercise. So let's do a short recap. So we implemented two activities. Both could be run from the main as the main activity, because they had this intent filters for launcher and for main. The first activity was kind of a manual fragment management. So we had two fragments, well, 3 fragments. One that was a source of navigation. And to use the navigation provided by the first fragment, we implemented on options checked interface. And in the activity, this interface was declared in the fragment. And the fragment was acquiring a reference to the activity in the onAttach function, and then used it in onChecked change. So once we clicked a different button, the listener was invoked, and this listener was in the main activity, and it replaced the fragments with preset fragments. We could create new ones or whatever. Now, one of our fragments was stateful. The dynamic fragment 2 was stateful, and it had this counter here. The problem was that our activity did not preserve this fragment. We could do that, for example, by having this activity override the onSafe instance state, and then restore manually data in F1 and F2, and that would work. But we didn't want to do that. We wanted the fragment to do it itself, and it wasn't that easy to do it using this flow. So we went to tabbed activity, which was hub generated for us, which is pretty awesome. And the main thing here was this section pager adapter. um, which was also very easy. So we just needed to define what was in which position, and the pager adapter manages the state of the items itself. So we don't need to make sure that it doesn't recreate the items. If we want to do it, then we need to do it a little bit differently, but we didn't. So we did want to reuse the same fragments. And pager adapter, this thing here, ViewPager, manages the lifetime so that it restores the state of the item of the fragment automatically. So we didn't need to run this thing, to do anything to make this work. I mean, we just needed to restore the bundle state. We wanted to trace it back to the place where the state is restored, so we can do it this way, and then the stack trace will be printed to our RAM console, and we can go as deep as we want to. And you can see some quite it's quite deep. I mean, you can go back to up to the zygote init. Once we do that, we said okay, that's fine, but we want our fragment to look differently on different orientations, and we could use the same for different many different things, and a list of those can be found, for example, once you add a new resource directory here, a new Android resource directory, and those are all available qualifiers. So keyboard type, navigation state, density, night mode, UI mode, screen width, locale, country, etc. Like all those magical things. And we can use those as qualifiers. And if we use them, then instead of our default layout, custom one dedicated for this set of qualifiers will be used. And the same can be done for values, the same can be done for icons, for drawable resources, and for, well, basically everything else. And that's it for today. Thank you for watching, and good luck.